In less than 10 minutes, I'll teach you these 3 simple steps which you can use to solve literally any problem at work and absolutely crush it. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, my name is Max Mal, and I'm a PMP certified project manager with over half a decade of experience leading established organizations and high growth startups. Now the reason I made this video is because as I look back on my career, throughout all of my work experiences and jobs, I realized I've been using the exact same framework and playbook for resolving some of the most complex problems out there. So I figured I'd make a video sharing what those steps are in the hopes that this will help you throughout your professional journey. Make sure you're subscribed, we're dropping a lot of gems coming soon. Okay, so it's super simple. There's 3 steps. Step 1 is discovery, step 2 is process mapping, and then step 3 is buy-in and execution. We'll go into each of these in depth, but at a really high level, step 1, discovery, is understanding what the problem or issue is. Step 2, process mapping. This is where you'll be working with stakeholders who are involved and actively facing and dealing with the problem, understanding what their current workflows are and what the workflows would look like in the optimal state. Step 3, buy-in and execution. This is where you've done your due diligence in understanding the problem. The next is buy-in, so making sure that the folks who are involved in that process, they're aware of how changes could be made better for them, and then rolling out the process that you've created. With that being said, let's dive into each step in depth. So let's start with discovery. And I love this word because it's so intuitive by what it means. So discovery, that means you're uncovering things, you're learning things for the first time. And that's oftentimes the case when you work at a new organization. There are oftentimes problems or challenges that you deal with that you're not familiar with. Through discovery, you're uncovering the context, the backstory, you're looking through documentation, doing all of these due diligence steps to really understand the context around why a problem is arising. From that discovery process, that also includes, reaching out to any stakeholders or team members who are subject matter experts, who are the ones who know the most about the context, picking their brain, understanding and filling in any gaps on the current process and the context around the problem. This is really key because if you think about it, you can't resolve problems that you don't truly understand. That's why during this process, it's really important that you uncover and you dig as much as you possibly can to really assert yourself as a subject matter expert. Not as someone who's changing workflows, but just as someone who understands the actual problem and someone who can be trusted with that knowledge as well. Step 2 is process mapping, and again, it's really intuitive. It's understanding how the problem arose and then piecing together what steps are currently in the process and what needs to be changed in order to avoid this problem in the future. Essentially, it's like process improvement. So process mapping is where you take all of that documentation, all that context that you've uncovered in step 1, and you're starting to piece it together into, why did those problems arise and how can those problems be avoided based on the workflows of the team members that are currently working. The way I like to go about process mapping is at the end of discovery, you should have a decent idea about the context of the problem and the people who have been involved. So take some time on your own to map out what the ideal state process looks like and ways that the problem can be avoided. Once you've already created this draft, next is time to start getting feedback from the folks who are intimately involved in that process. So reach out to your stakeholders, to your internal team members who are dealing with this problem on a daily basis. Collect their feedback, let them review the draft of your understanding, and then tell them to absolutely destroy it or to provide their guidance on any steps that you didn't quite understand. This collaborative effort is really key to correctly mapping out the process and understanding what the current state workflow is. My recommendation here is, after you've done a couple of rounds, you've iterated, and you've finally drafted a pretty decent version of what the current process is, you'll want to create a separate copy for what the optimized workflow could look like. Oftentimes, having an outsider perspective on a current process is super, super valuable, not only because you're an additional body that can help provide, some problem solving, but also you're not someone who is currently in the day-to-day weeds of doing that job or doing that responsibility. You're someone who has a different perspective, and that can be very valuable because oftentimes folks can be really caught up in their routines. can be very difficult for them to understand or see things that may be pretty obvious or just pretty clear to someone who does not work in that day-to-day field. So from the process mapping, your goals are to have what the current state workflows are for any team members who are involved in that process. And then number 2 is to create a list of what the optimized workflow could look like. I always recommend start at a really high level. So if you're working, in a particular industry like construction, you're trying to build a house and the house continually has problems at a certain step, start viewing the process map at a really high level. So for a house, maybe it can be laying the foundation, can be phase 1. Phase 2 can be then laying the structure, whether that's the framework of the house, the cinder blocks, the wood beams, all of that stuff, and then start getting more granular. With a process map, you'll want to make sure that it makes logical sense and that it can be really easy to follow. So my guiding principle is start really high level at different phases or buckets if you're able to consolidate some of the processes there, and then within each bucket, drill down into the details, which can really help you understand the nuances. After a couple of rounds of iteration, review, and feedback from your stakeholders, next we get to step 3, which is buy-in and execution. This is ultimately one of the most exciting steps because for step 1 and 2, all of it is just theoretical. All of it is just documentation. It's getting you up to speed for how to resolve the issues and how to make things better. Step 3 is really where you put that into action and we get to see the results of all of our labor. So buy-in is the first part, and that's really crucial because you'll want to make sure that everyone who's involved in that process, who's dealing with the problem, they understand the value that you're providing. They understand that this process that you're changing or optimizing, it's going to make their lives better. And in order to do so, you need to really understand, number 1, the value proposition, and number 2, you need to genuinely know whether or not this process will make their lives better. Ultimately, if you're putting in a new process and it doesn't help anyone, what good is that? You're just training people to do a different workflow that isn't really accomplishing any of the goals. So with buy-in, make sure that you have the process map laid out, make sure you understand how to optimize and remove any problems from the current process, and then start working with stakeholder leads or folks who are in higher positions who are able to make those judgment calls, get their buy-in, get meetings with them, make sure they understand, the urgency around why this needs to be resolved, the impact around why this needs to be resolved, and how this overall potentially helps their goals and their agendas as well. Then we get to the executing step, and this is where you start rolling out the new process and training. And a big part of this is education and training. You want to make sure that the folks who are following the new workflow, they have the proper steps so they're not confused. You don't want folks to have to change what they're currently doing and not guide them along the process. If that's the case, then a lot of times things may be inefficient, they may have questions, things can arise. Anytime you change a process or workflow, there can be room for even more errors or problems. So be really intentional about how you set the stage. Whenever you're implementing a new process or resolving a problem, you always want to start with the highest volume, highest impact problems. So focus on the pain points that folks genuinely dread going to work for. The points that prevent the company from growing, the points that everyone can group together in a line and say, okay, yeah, I totally see why this needs to be resolved. Start there. It makes buy-in and it makes rolling out the new process, the new problem solving, a lot easier. Folks will be bought in, and then slowly continue to introduce and iterate on that process until you have the entire optimized workflow in place. I guarantee you, if there's anything that you get from this video, focus on the problems that keep people up at night. Focus on the problems that prevent your company from growing, that can be seen at the executive level all the way high up, all the way to the ground floor. Guaranteed, if you focus on those principles, the work that you're doing will be seen as urgent and process can be moved a lot faster that way. Okay, well, I hope you all found this video helpful. Truly, these are 3 really simple steps: discovery, process mapping, buy-in, and execution. At a really high level, I've used these guiding principles to resolve some of the most complex issues. Every organization I've ever worked at, these 3 key principles have really helped me to assert myself as a subject matter expert and have allowed me to understand the context and to make my teammates' lives better. Being a project manager, it's really important to always look at how processes can be optimized. So I hope this video helps you with putting on your project manager hat on. Comment below what you learned and any tips that you've used to help resolve any problems and just make work better for you and your teammates.